From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
You think the Keystone XL's bad? Have you heard of the Energy East? It's a 1.1 million barrel per day pipeline they want to build from Alberta to Atlantic Canada across 185 First Nations territories. And, you know, I think that is the reality of it.
The People's Climate Movement heats up in New York with the largest climate protest in history. Over 100,000 people preparing to march Sunday. We'll speak to Clayton Thomas Muller of the Indigenous Tar Sands Campaign and Filipino climate justice activist Liddy Nakpil. We'll also hear why thousands of labor activists are joining the People's Climate March.
The same people that are exploiting the earth, that 1% of the 1% are the same people that are denying workers' rights in this country and oppress workers all over the world. So for labor, this is our fight.
Estela Vasquez joins us, Executive Vice President of 1199 SEIU, and we'll look at the growing movement to divest from fossil fuel companies with the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, President of Union Theological Seminary. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Voters in Scotland have opted not to form an independent country. With a record turnout of 84%, about 55% of voters chose to remain in the United Kingdom, while 45% backed independence. In the wake of the vote, British Prime Minister David Cameron has vowed to give Scotland more independent powers as part of a process known as devolution.
The people of Scotland have spoken, and it is a clear result. They have kept our country of four nations together. And like millions of other people, I am delighted. As I said during the campaign, it would have broken my heart to see our United Kingdom come to an end.
The U.S. Senate has voted 78-22 in favor of a plan by the Obama administration to train and equip Syrian rebels fighting militants known as the Islamic State. Just 10 Democrats and 12 Republicans voted against the plan. The measure passed the House of Representatives earlier this week by a vote of 273 to 165, with 85 Democrats and 71 Republicans voting no. President Obama praised Congress for its rare bipartisan action.
As I said last week, I believe that we're strongest as a nation when the President and Congress work together. And I want to thank leaders in Congress for the speed and seriousness with which they approach this urgent issue, in keeping with the bipartisanship that is the hallmark of American foreign policy at its best.
The measure passed by Congress does not actually have any funding attached to pay for arming or training the rebels. After passing the bill Thursday, the Senate adjourned for 6 weeks until after midterm elections in November. The vote in the Senate came as Islamic State militants besieged the Kurdish city of Kobani in northern Syria after seizing 21 villages in 24 hours near the Turkish border. On Thursday, the Islamic State also released a new video showing a British freelance photojournalist whose kidnapping was previously under a media blackout. John Catley was seized with James Foley in Syria in 2012. He's worked for Getty Images and other news organizations. The United Nations has declared the Ebola outbreak in West Africa a threat to international peace and security and announced plans for a new health mission. UN Health Chief Margaret Chan called the outbreak likely the greatest peacetime challenge that the United Nations and its agencies have ever faced. More than 5,000 people have been infected. Over 2,600 have died. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says the number of cases is doubling every 3 weeks.
This unprecedented situation requires unprecedented steps to save lives and safeguard peace security. Therefore, I have decided to establish a United Nations Emergency Health Mission combining the World Health Organization's strategic perspective with a very strong logistics and operational capability.
Sierra Leone has begun a 3-day nationwide lockdown in an effort to contain Ebola. Residents have been told not to leave their homes from Friday to Sunday as health workers go door to door to identify cases and educate people. Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, has criticized the measure, saying, quote, forced quarantines and lockdowns are driving people underground and jeopardizing the trust between people and health providers. In Guinea, 8 bodies have been found after a team of Ebola health educators and journalists went missing in a remote area. The team was attacked with rocks by residents when they arrived in the village earlier this week. A government spokesperson told Reuters the victims were found in a latrine. The White House has unveiled $46 million in new military aid to Ukraine. President Obama held talks at the White House Thursday with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, who had asked the United States for weapons to help it combat a pro-Russian insurgency. Obama declined to include lethal aid as part of the aid package.
I'm pleased that during this meeting, we reaffirmed that commitment to Ukraine, and we are providing additional assistance, both economic and security assistance to Ukraine to make sure that not only are they able to weather this storm economically, but they're also going to be able to continue to build up an effective security force to defend themselves from aggression.
In Bahrain, human rights activist Mariam Al-Khawaja has been released from prison. She was detained last month after she tried to enter Bahrain to visit her father, the activist Abdulhadi Al-Khawaja, who is on hunger strike as he serves a life term. On the day of Mariam Al-Khawaja's release, 14 other activists were sentenced to life terms, purportedly for detonating explosives at a protest. Mariam Al-Khawaja still faces a charge of assaulting a police officer, which she denies. Bahrain hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, which is responsible for all naval forces in the Gulf. Bahrain has waged a crackdown on government critics since a 2011 pro-democracy uprising against the U.S.-backed monarchy. The Chinese e-commerce company Alibaba begins trading on the New York Stock Exchange today with a market value more than twice as high as eBay's. Alibaba went public Thursday with one of the largest public offerings in history. China has fined the British pharmaceutical maker GlaxoSmithKline $490 million over claims it bribed doctors and hospitals to promote its products. It's the largest corporate fine in China's history. A top executive for the firm in China, Mark Riley, has also been sentenced to 3 years in prison. Home Depot has announced the second-largest credit card breach on record. 56 million cards have been compromised by malware at the retailer's payment terminals from April to September. Panama has announced it plans to invite Cuba to the next Summit of the Americas in 2015, despite heavy U.S. opposition. Cuba's exclusion became a key issue of debate at the last summit in 2012, which Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa boycotted the meeting over Cuba's absence. This summer is officially the hottest summer ever recorded. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, global temperatures reached an all-time high for the June-August period. Last month was also the hottest August since records began in 1880. The report comes as New York City is set to host what could be the largest climate change protest in history. Organizers expect more than 100,000 people to converge for the People's Climate March Sunday. On Thursday night, the People's Climate train pulled into Penn Station after a cross-country trip that began in California. We'll spend the rest of the hour on the climate and this weekend's march after headlines. The consequences of extreme heat and drought are being felt in California, where a massive wildfire has rapidly consumed forest land near Sacramento. The King Fire erupted overnight Wednesday, more than doubling in size to become the second largest in California this year. A man has been arrested and charged with deliberately setting the fire. New details have emerged about the domestic violence case against NFL player Jonathan Dwyer after his arrest Wednesday. According to a police report of the July incident, Dwyer headbutted his wife in the face after she resisted his sexual advances, fracturing her nose, then threatened to kill himself after she fled. The next day, he punched his wife in the face and threw a shoe at their 17-month-old son. Dwyer's team, the Arizona Cardinals, has barred him from playing but continued to pay him. In Alabama, a federal judge is facing calls for his resignation after his wife said he hurled her to the ground, pulled her hair, and kicked her. District Court Judge Mark Fuller was actually arrested more than a month ago. But amidst the scandal over domestic violence in the NFL, federal lawmakers from Alabama have begun calling for his ouster this week. In Bell, Florida, a man shot and killed his 28-year-old daughter and her 6 children, then killed himself. The man had reportedly previously served time in prison for firearms violations after killing his 8-year-old son with a high-powered rifle in a purported hunting accident. An 83-year-old peace activist has defeated trespassing charges for protesting outside a base in upstate New York where U.S. drones are piloted remotely. Yves Tataz was arrested outside the Hancock Field Air National Guard base with 30 others last year as she read aloud the First Amendment of the Constitution, asserting her right to free speech. This week, a judge in DeWitt Town Court dismissed the charges against her. After her victory, Tataz described her act of protest.
Did was stand outside the air base and I read from the First Amendment of the Constitution, which clearly states that we are free to protest what I believe are the illegal actions of the drone.
And activist Marianne Grady was sentenced to a year in prison for her role in peaceful protests at the Hancock Air Base. She's out on bail pending appeal. The New York City Borough of Manhattan has now the greatest gap between rich and poor in the country. New census data shows the top 5 wealthiest households in Manhattan have seen their income rise 9% and now make 88 times more than the poorest 20%. Across New York City, more than 1 in 5 people are living in poverty. The news coincides with a report from the New York Civil Liberties Union, which finds New York State is illegally failing to provide public defense services to poor people who cannot afford attorneys when accused of crimes. In some areas, public defenders are carrying nearly 3 times the maximum recommended caseload. A new Gallup poll finds public trust in the mainstream media has returned to an all-time low. Just 40% of Americans believe in the mass media's ability to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Since the poll began in 1997, trust has only dropped that low once before, in 2012. This year also saw a sharp rise in the number of Americans who think the media is too far to the right. And a new report describes how hundreds of high-ranking sheriffs and police from across the United States have traveled to Israel for so-called counterterrorism training. According to the Center for Investigative Reporting, since 2002, at least 300 top officials have participated in seminars which are privately funded by the Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Committee, and Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. Police in both Israel and U.S. cities like Ferguson have also been using the same equipment, from tear gas and stun grenades to long-range noise devices that send out high-pitched sounds. For years, Israel's also conducted trainings abroad, including in Chiapas, Mexico, where Israeli officials have trained Mexican police and military forces on combating the Zapatista uprising. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. This Sunday, New York City is set to host what could be the largest climate change protest in history, when organizers expect more than 100,000 people to converge for a People's Climate March. Many have already arrived from around the country. On Thursday night, the People's Climate Train pulled into Penn Station after a cross-country trip that began in California, with stops in Reno, Denver, Salt Lake City, Omaha, and Chicago.
My name is Valerie Love. I work for Center for Biological Diversity as the No Tar Sands organizer. And I've been organizing this People's Climate Train, which has been beyond our wildest expectations. We had 170 climate activists come together on a 4-day cross-country trip where we had workshops and teach-ins, discussions, art and music all along the way. And we saw the amazing beauty of our country as well as the very real climate impacts and learned about the community struggles all along the way. way.
My name is Amanda G.C. Butu. I am 27 from San Francisco, California, and I got on the climate train as an invited guest. But on the train, I've learned so much about how I can be a part of the movement of helping save the climate. I do community gardening, which is already one step in the right direction, but I want to be able to impact more people. And with the information that I retained on this trip, I feel like I can further my movement of helping others with fresh food and fresh water and just being the best that I can be.
The People's Climate March comes ahead of a United Nations summit this Tuesday where leaders from 125 countries are expected to announce non-binding initiatives to reduce carbon emissions that fuel global warming. President Obama got a head start Thursday when he announced his administration would dedicate nearly $70 million to install solar power in homes and businesses and improve energy efficiency in rural areas. One new project by the Department of Energy would train 50,000 veterans to become solar panel installers in the next 6 years.
Well, as the topic of climate change and what to do about it takes center stage here in New York City in the coming week, we host a roundtable discussion. Here from the Philippines is Liddy Nakpil. She's a member of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, a member of the International Board of 350.org, and also a convener of the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. Estela Vasquez is also with us. She's Executive Vice President of 1199 SEIU, that's the Service Employees International Union, which expects to mobilize several thousand members on Sunday. In July, they joined with the New York State Nurses Association to announce their opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline due to public health and climate concerns. And Reverend Dr. Serene Jones is with us, President of Union Theological Seminary, which is hosting more than 200 religious and spiritual leaders from across the world for a Religions for the Earth conference this weekend before they all march on Sunday. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Why don't we begin with you, Reverend Dr. Serene Jones. Why is Union Theological Seminary participating in the Climate March?
Well, the real question is, why isn't every single religious person in the United States getting to this climate march? At Union, we deeply believe that your Christian faith, your faith in God, and your commitment to love in the world means that you need to be committed to social justice. And right now, there is no greater social justice issue on our planet than climate change.
Well, earlier this year, your seminary took a bold step in divesting from the fossil fuel industry. Could you talk about that decision, coming to it, and the impact it's had on the religious community in the country?
Yes, we were very proud to be the first seminary in the world to divest, and we did it for the usually understood political, economic, and social reasons. But for us, the guiding force behind it was our faith commitment. We believe that as people of faith, we are charged, we are morally accountable for care of the earth, and to not engage in divestment and to back away from climate change is to really, to use religious language, to be sinful.
Can you talk about the other churches that have divested?
Yes, we were very supported by the United Church of Christ. The Presbyterians are right now in the process of considering it, and the list is growing daily. The churches, in one sense, are way ahead of the seminaries in this regard.
And has the World Council of Churches also?
World Council of Churches, yes, who are meeting at Union this weekend to be part of this summit. They have divested.
What about the other part of that, divesting from fossil fuels, but where you reinvest?
Yes, and that is also a part of what we are exploring with respect to divestment. What we've discovered in our portfolio is there's a number of fossil fuel companies who are themselves trying to shift their resources to alternative resources like wind and sun. And we're figuring out how in our portfolio to support that by shifting our resources in that direction.
And Liddy Nakpil, the importance of this particular march coming just before the UN climate summit, and specifically how in the Philippines this has become such a major issue.
Well, the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. You know, typhoons are a reality in the Philippines, but in the last few years, we have been visited by ever-increasing number and magnitude of super typhoons. I think the last one that the world has really come to know a lot about was Typhoon Haiyan, which was the strongest typhoon ever to hit landfall in recorded human history, we were told. And this typhoon has caused more than 2 million people to be homeless and has caused more than 10,000 deaths in just a matter of a few days. So this issue is really important for us. There are several of us who are here to be in solidarity with a march. That is our actually foremost concern, not so much with the UN Climate Summit, from which we're expecting very little, I'm sorry to say.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but we are also joined by Clayton Thomas Muller, who is an indigenous rights and environmental justice activist and writer, leading the campaign, one of the leaders of the Idle No More campaign, co-director of the Indigenous Tar Sands campaign of the Polaris Institute, came down from Canada. Clayton Thomas Muller is a member of the Matthias Kalom Cree Nation in northern Manitoba, Canada, living in Ottawa. Here for the People's Climate March. Welcome to Democracy Now! Forgive me if I mispronounced any part of that.
You did well.
Why come down from Canada?
Well, Idle No More, along with hundreds of other Indigenous communities and organizations the world over, have sent representatives here to participate and join in the tens of thousands, hopefully hundreds of thousands that'll be marching in the streets on Sunday. I think, as mentioned by my sister from the Philippines, you know, Indigenous peoples the world over are the most vulnerable when we think about the impacts of climate change, whether it's forest-dependent peoples, coastal-dependent peoples, and of course, Indigenous peoples in the high Arctic are experiencing climate change on a compounding rate much worse than many other regions on the planet. And there's a double-edged blade there because Indigenous communities also happen to be experiencing the frontline impacts of the fossil fuel regime. You know, everywhere that big oil is operating in Canada, you know, we have the controversial Canadian tar sands, and Cree and Dene communities have massive cancer clusters occurring in their community because of the bioregional contamination that's happening from big oil's footprint in their lands. And so there's great concern about the lack of concrete political action from world leaders, and Indigenous leaders have converged here in New York City to send a very clear and direct message that our movement is strong and it's converging with other movements to put pressure on President Obama and, of course, on our own Prime Minister Stephen Harper and other world leaders to take concrete action on climate change.
We're going to break, and when we come back, we'll also find out why folks right here in New York, particularly labor activists, are also marching in this climate change march. It's called the People's Climate March. It's expected to be the largest climate march in history. This leading up to Tuesday, where expectations vary on what will happen inside the UN for a one-day UN climate summit. This is before the UN climate summit that takes place in Lima, Peru in December. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Back in a minute. That's our guest, Clayton Thomas Muller, performing last night at the New School at the launch of Naomi Klein's new book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. We spoke to her for the hour yesterday, and you can see that interview as well as another hour we did with her after the broadcast at democracynow.org. The New School, hundreds of people came out, not only for her talk, but for a panel discussion about the climate and what can be done about it. There are hundreds of events taking place all over the city, not to mention around the world this weekend as the lead up to the People's Climate March on Sunday. Union Theological Seminary is hosting more than 200 theologians from around the world. Our guest today is Reverend Dr. Serene Jones. Liddy Knockpill in from the Philippines for the protest. As we were saying, Clayton Thomas Muller down from Canada with many Indigenous rights leaders. And we're joined by Estela Vasquez, Executive Vice President of 1199 SEIU. In July, they joined with the New York State Nurses Association to announce their opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline due to public health and climate concerns. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!
Well, I wanted to turn to Estela Vasquez now, your longtime Latino leader in this city and, of course, a labor leader as well. The decision by some of the major unions in the city for the first time, I think, to really actively participate in an environmental march of this kind. What was the debate within 1199? And you've also obviously come out against the Keystone pipeline as well.
I will say, Juan, and thank you for the invitation, that there was no debate in 1199. That was very natural for us to make a decision that this is where we need to be Sunday. This is where we need to mobilize our members. This is where we need to say to the powers that be in this country and around the world, it is time to stop the madness. Our members were frontline in the efforts during Super Hurricane Sandy almost 2 years ago. It is our members that helped evacuate NYU Hospital in the middle of the night and other institutions. It is our members in the Rockaways, in Red Hook in Brooklyn, who live in public housing, whose apartment buildings were flooded, that were left without electricity. So for us, it is a question of defending workers' rights, not only in the workplace, but in the communities where they live. It is a matter of public health. It is a matter of defending workers' rights and the right to live in an environment that is free of contamination. And as I mentioned last night, the same people that are oppressing workers are the same people that are making huge, enormous profits from burning fossil fuels. They are the 1% of the 1%, and we are the 99% that needs to stand up.
And battle within some of organized labor for those unions that see projects like XL as a means of creating jobs and spurring the economy. What's your response to that?
I think our hope is that as this debate continues to deepen, that there will be more public awareness and more education, and that from the ranks of those unions, the cry will rise up to the leadership that this is not an issue about preserving jobs, that we can preserve jobs and have jobs in a safe environment that increase the ability to create more employment without continuing to damage Mother Earth.
Why would SEIU, 1199, take a position on Keystone XL?
Because it's the right thing to do. It's like the question when the Reverend said before, when you ask, why not other churches? And she said, why not everyone else? So for the labor unions, I think the lesson to learn is that the fight for workers' rights is not just in the workplace for wages and safe working conditions. In the workplace, there also have to be safe working conditions in the city, in the country where we live, and that part of having a clean environment is part of the worker struggle.
Clay, you're sitting right next to Estela. You have come down from the struggle in Canada around the Keystone XL. We often refer to it, but don't really talk about physically what it is, where it starts. Can you explain?
The Keystone XL pipeline is one of half a dozen mega pipeline proposals that are sitting on the table to pump tar sands crude to the coast.
And that is tar sands crude is?
This is bitumen oil from the Alberta tar sands development in northern Alberta. The Keystone XL will pipe from Alberta all the way to Port Arthur, Texas, about 800,000 barrels per day. Threatening the Oglala Aquifer, crossing over the sacred Black Hills of Lakota territory. We have a bus of Dakota representatives that are coming here that have been fighting the northern segment of the Keystone XL since President Obama has already approved the southern segment, and it's already pumping crude today. The important thing for people to understand about these pipeline fights is that while they're important, they provided a corridor for organizing and invigorating the U.S. environmental movement, the Canadian environmental movement. There's already 6 million barrels per day approved in Canada's tar sands, but it's stranded. It's a stranded economic asset. And so we're beating big oil's expansion proposals in Canada and having a great impact. And a lot of those activists that have been fighting, not just the Keystone XL, but the other 5 mega pipelines across the continent they're trying to build, are here in New York, joining in the march to send a clear message.
You've referred at times to the United States and Canada as rogue nations when it comes to the exploitation of the tar sands. Could you expound on that compared to even other nations in terms of what's happening with energy policy?
Well, we have, a very extremist right-wing government in Canada led by Prime Minister Harper and his Conservative majority. Prime Minister Harper is an embarrassment to most Canadians. He is not even participating in the Ban Ki-moon Climate Summit. I believe he's going to another dinner somewhere. But both the United States and Canada, have been working in collusion, and really these pipelines, the tar sands, are the crown jewel in the United States' long-term energy security strategy. And these pipelines are really about hardwiring our economy into a dirty energy economy for the next century, all on the backs of Indigenous peoples on the front line and fence line communities impacted by these pipelines, which do rupture. Look at Kalamazoo. 3 years later, after that Enbridge pipeline blew up, it's a tar sands pipeline, over $1 billion spent trying to clean up, and it's still poisoned in that river.
Why are Indigenous communities on the front line?
Indigenous communities are on the front line because it's their land, their homes, where they're ripping apart the boreal forest, mining this oil out of the ground, their waters that are getting poisoned. The bioregional contamination that's happening in the Athabasca region of Alberta has been devastating to the health of local Dene and Cree and Métis people who call that place home. And that's why they're coming here with a very clear message saying, stop this at the source. We need the climate justice movement to, yes, stop the pipelines, but help us in Alberta stop the expansion of the Alberta tar sands.
And Lydia, I wanted to ask you in terms of the situation with countries like the Philippines. Estela has mentioned that her union has many members from Guyana, which is a very a country that is facing rising sea level problems as well along its coast. Could you talk about how the movement is building in your country around the issue of standing up to the advanced countries' refusal to deal with climate change?
Well, there's a lot of movements that are working on different issues, but all are aware that these issues are part of our fight against climate change. One of the strong movements there are movements against dirty energy. We have movements in different communities fighting against coal, the setting up of coal power plants, the mining of coal. We also have movements that are being strengthened and expanded in areas that are affected by climate change. We have many grassroots communities in Leyte, in Samar. These are the hardest hit areas where Typhoon Haiyan visited last year, and they are really understanding very deeply that their situation is not just about natural calamities or disasters. It's very much caused by this climate change. So we're very happy to be part of this global movement to strengthen the movements in the fight for climate justice.
I wanted to turn for a minute to the remarks made on the opening day of the UN Climate Summit in Poland last year. Democracy Now! Was there. Chief climate negotiator from the Philippines, Yeb Sanyo, who really became the rock star of this UN summit, gave an emotional appeal to the world to address the climate crisis following Typhoon Haiyan, one of the strongest storms, if not the strongest, ever to make landfall. This is a part of what Yeb Sanyo said.
Typhoons such as Haiyan and its impacts represent a sobering reminder to the international community that we cannot afford to delay climate action. Warsaw must deliver on enhancing ambition and should muster the political will to address climate change and build that important bridge towards Peru and Paris. It might be said that it must be poetic justice that the Typhoon Haiyan was so big that its diameter spanned the distance between Warsaw and Paris. Mr. President, in Doha, we asked, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? If not here, then where? But here, in Warsaw, we may very well ask these same forthright questions. What my country is going through as a result of this extreme climate event is madness. The climate crisis is madness. Mr. President, we can stop this madness right here in Warsaw.
That was Chief Climate Negotiator for the Philippines, Yeb Sanyo, on the opening day of the UN summit in Warsaw. He then announced he was fasting for the 2 weeks of that summit. But Liddy Nakbil, what has happened in this year? Do you feel anything's gotten accomplished? And do you think anything will happen inside the UN on Tuesday as perhaps 100,000 people march outside?
Well, we have been monitoring the international climate negotiations very carefully, very closely, and it is really to our dismay to say that nothing much has changed. And in fact, there are all many signs to point to the fact that things are even getting worse because world leaders are trying to point to kinds of solutions that are in fact making it worse for our people and not really getting us anywhere. So for this UN Climate Summit that will take place on September 23, many of us are not expecting much, which is not to say we're not going to demand what the government should be doing as an obligation to us, their citizens, but there's all evidence that points to the fact that I think despite the many beautiful words that many of them will deliver on September 23, including President Obama, the reality is quite the opposite. They are expanding the fossil fuel industry. They are scaling up the production of fossil fuel. Energy consumption of fossil fuel is going up. Just to cite an example, in the United States, there's a lot of celebration about the victory against coal production and the use of coal, which I think is very important. But what people should know is that the U.S. is increasing its exports of coal. So they're not using it here, but they're asking us to use it in other places. And because coal is supposedly a cheap source of energy, this is now becoming the trend in developing countries to scale up the production and the use of coal. So this is something that is really a reality that should be contrasted to what will be said in September 23.
Well, Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, I'd like to ask you about that contradiction between the inaction and the paralysis of the government leaders who keep meeting around the issue and this growing movement from the grassroots levels in all of these countries demanding immediate change. With the faith leaders, you're in the position where you're both connected to those grassroots movement, but also have the ear of some of these leaders. Vice President Gore is speaking as part of the events that you're organizing. Could you talk about the that contradiction and how the role of faith leaders in trying to bridge it and affect change?
Yes, actually yesterday morning at Union we had a wonderful event in which former Vice President Al Gore spoke to the African American and Latino clergy in New York, who have historically been the forces for change in this metropolitan area around human rights issues, social justice issues, issuing the moral imperative. And it's very clear that right now, globally, if we're going to turn this machine of death around, it's going to take a mass movement, and it's going to take a movement from the people. We can't wait for the governments, for the UN to make those decisions. And when it comes to labor, when it comes to indigenous commitments and religious traditions, when it comes to international engagement, the people involved in all of those struggles do so out of deep spiritual resources that they have. Our traditions say a lot about the love that we are called to have for our earth, not the impulse to destroy it, and to begin to lift up those resonant voices that already stir in our movements and bring them together. So at Union, for the next several days, we're bringing together 200 indigenous and international leaders to talk about this and to work on making a strong public statement about what our religious traditions around the world share when it comes to addressing climate change and the issues of the destruction of our earth and the severe disparate impact on marginal communities.
Could you take us through the divestment debate, if it was a debate at all at Union, for churches, religious groups, mosques, synagogues that might be listening right now, thinking about what can they do, whether their resources are vast or small?
Well, it was interesting at Union. Like Estella said, we did not have any controversy around it. It was a unanimous decision. But it is...
Did any corporations, funds weigh in, try to pressure you, just seeing that you could set an example?
No, we didn't feel any of that pressure, but it was also perhaps because we were so clear-sighted about it. And when you approach it not as a primarily economic or political issue, although it is that, but as a moral issue, it's very hard to argue theologically that we're not doing the right thing.
I wanted to ask Estella about this whole issue of divestment, because your union sits on the boards of pension funds for many of these hospitals that your members are in. Columbia Presbyterian, NYU, all these gigantic medical institutions have their own pension fund investments. Whether the union has begun to put pressure on those funds, because normally you have about half the membership of these pension boards.
Well, in terms of the pension, it's not just us. Any organized labor place, you have pension funds that are jointly administered by the employer and by the union. We have not begun that conversation, but this reminds me of the divestment movement back in the 80s in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And I believe that fairly soon we will begin to have that conversation. And it's the issue of how you balance the question of economics versus the moral imperative of doing the right thing.
Now, Estella, I know you have to leave at this break because you have a meeting right after the show. But I wanted to ask about your own past activism. You come from the Dominican Republic, and how it compares then with what you're doing today around the issue of climate.
That's a tall question. Back in the Dominican Republic in the 60s, after the execution of the dictatorship Trujillo, it was a period of social effervescence and upheaval. Between 1961 and 1965, we went through numerous coups d'etat, had the first free elections, elected a president, and had him deposed 9 months later by the United States.
U.S. military moving into the Dominican Republic.
And then we went through a period of resistance, popular insurrection, and then the Marines showed up. So I came to this country. I was released from jail in August, came to this country August 13 of 1965, and went through the cultural shock that every new immigrant goes through, not knowing English, coming to a city of less than about 350,000 people to a city of over 8 million people. And I would say what sparked my involvement in this country was the example of the Black Panthers and my friend here, Juan Gonzalez, and the Young Lords. I found the Puerto Rican community was my first avenue of engagement and involvement. And I think since then, the involvement has been on issues of fighting gentrification in the neighborhood where I live, which is East Harlem, to finding at home in 1199 in the labor movement, which gives me the opportunity not only to talk about social justice issues and political activism in the community, but engage workers in raising the question of class consciousness, teaching people that we are the working class and that there is profound differences between those that own the means of production and those that work in the place. And I found it fascinating last evening, the whole theory behind Naomi Klein's book, that how do you achieve economic, and in this case, environmental justice when capitalism prevails, and the modus operandi in capitalism is profits at any cost. So there is a question of looking at a real effort around democracy and participatory democracy and people's engagement to really address the issue of climate justice, and that is a tall order to achieve that under a capitalist system.
How many workers will be marching on Sunday with you?
We expect that it will be a few thousand members of 1199, and 32BJ, our sister union, will be there. PEF will be there. I know that the nurses,
Workers Union, I think.
Transport Workers Union, Local 3, Electrical Workers Union will be there. In DC 37, we expect that we will have a significant contingent of organized labor marching, because workers are realizing that the issue of climate change, what happens to our environment, is not an abstract issue, that the environment, like my friend Neri Bautista said, is where we work, where we live, and where we play. So therefore, it is our fight. It's not some esoteric climate, issue of some place. It is our home. It is our community. It's our city, and we all have to fight for it.
Environment is not just where you go on vacation.
No, no, definitely it's not.
Estela Vasquez, I want to thank you for being with us, Executive Vice President of SEIU, Local 1199, well, now called 1199 SEIU here in New York. And we're going to continue our conversation with our other guests after break. Reverend Dr. Serene Jones of Union Theological Seminary, Liddy Knockville of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, and Clayton Thomas Muller, Indigenous Rights and Environmental Justice activist. Stay with us.
Thank you.
People's Climate March PSA, created by Caroline Sampanero and Elizabeth Press. Music by the Rude Mechanical Orchestra. The band celebrating its 10th anniversary is one of the many marching bands participating in Sunday's event. In fact, I believe there are 1,200 marching bands that are expected to be a part of this 100,000-plus strong People's Climate March on Sunday. It begins at Columbus Circle on Sunday. Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting live from 10:30 Eastern Standard Time to 1:30. Check it out at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, and our guests are the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, President of the Union Theological Seminary, Liddy Knockville, Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, based in the Philippines, Clayton Thomas Muller, Indigenous Rights and Environmental Justice activist and writer. Clay, you talked about the number of energy projects. We know Keystone XL. President Obama has put off a decision on this year after year. People are saying, on one hand, it's a people's victory that he hasn't made a decision, but also the question, why hasn't he made a decision? And yet you say Keystone XL is not even the biggest pipeline. Explain, what are the others?
Well, it's important to understand that if you look at industry's data, that it's not a, there's been a debate lately about, well, do you want bomb trains from the Bakken fracking boom in North Dakota blowing up in your community, or do you want a safe pipeline? And people have been debating about pipelines versus bomb trains.
What do you mean bomb trains?
Well, the oil that's fracked is extremely explosive. The tragedy in Lake Mégantic in Quebec, where 50 people lost their lives when one of these trains blew up. There was Alabama as well as Virginia. These trains blew up. It's a very dangerous thing that's happening in America with fracked oil being transported by trains through our communities because they are extremely explosive. And the oil by rail ratio has risen over 1,000% in the last couple of years. Now, on the tar sands pipeline issue, there's the Northern Enbridge Gateway proposal, the Houston-based Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline in southern BC. There's the Keystone XL. There's the Energy East Pipeline, the second mega project that TransCanada put on the table because of the victory of grassroots movement power holding back the State Department on the KXL.
What's Energy East?
Energy East is a 1.1 million barrel per day pipeline. It's over 4,000 kilometers from Alberta to Atlantic Canada. Mi'kmaqui territory in New Brunswick is where it ends. This pipeline includes 3,000 kilometers of about 40-year-old natural gas pipeline that they want to repurpose to pump superheated, diluted dilbit, bitumen, tar sands crude. This stuff, is the same stuff that ruptured in the Enbridge pipeline in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And this pipeline is about the same age as the pipeline that blew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, fouling that river. And so it crosses over 185 First Nations territories in Canada, and First Nations peoples are organizing along with municipalities and urban centers also touched by this pipeline.
And in this country, I don't think we recognize the importance of the First Nations populations in Canada. Could you talk about that and the significance as part of the labor force? Well,
the Idle No More movement.
And explain what Idle No More is.
Idle No More popped onto the scene about 2 years ago. It was the result of a political tornado that the Conservative government was experiencing as a result of their super law omnibus bill agenda, where they gutted virtually every participatory democratic mechanism in Canadian democracy with just 2 super bills. And they have more coming down the pipeline, no pun intended. And Idle No More came from Indigenous women who, started organizing on community education meetings to try and organize our base to stop Harper's agenda. And it took off. It took off on the internet. It went wild. And, within a matter of months, we achieved a day of action where we actually stopped every single train in the province of Ontario. We closed down 6 border crossings to the United States, all with just 1 arrest, which demonstrated the incredible might of Indigenous social movements in Canada. And I think that the government of Canada is very concerned about the Indigenous social movements uniting with organized labor, uniting with the Quebec student striker movements and other social movements to challenge the agenda of big oil in Canada, because big oil is writing policy in Canada, is running our government, and they're doing it to provide oil to the United States and now, of course, to China through the bilateral free trade agreement that Harper just ratified illegally with that country.
Liddy Knackpole and Dr. Serene Jones, the women-led nature of the environmental movement, I mean, whether we're talking Idle No More in Canada, it's very striking to see so many women at the heads. I mean, you're the head of the Union Theological Seminary. You came from Yale. You were a professor there for many years. Talk about that. What is it about the climate movement?
Well, first thing I should say is women have been leading these movements for centuries. It's just that we're only starting to notice that they are the ones behind the scenes making things happen. So it's not really a new thing, but to be out front and be explicit about it is, and it's very exciting. And I think, I don't want to speak universally for all women, but I think that in the heart of feminism, but also just in the heart of Indigenous women's experience is a deep an abiding sense for what it means to create life and nurture life and care for life. So when I, as a woman and a religious leader, think about what's happening right now with this crisis between the capitalist drive to extract and consume and what's happening to our climate and these grassroots movements which are pushing back and saying, no, it's a political crisis, but it's also a spiritual crisis. These grassroots movements are saying, no, not only do we not accept these actions, but we don't accept the spiritual view of what life is about that lies behind them. We are not simply people who are called to consume whatever we can to try to make us happy and to extract whatever we need. No, we're people who are deeply interconnected, who are called to love and care for each other, and who are to honor the very earth that we ourselves came from.
And Liddy, when we were talking with Naomi Klein yesterday, she talked about this whole move of the energy industry to basically create sacrificed communities, especially in the third world. As you were talking about the exportation of coal from the United States while limiting the use of coal here in the country. This whole issue of the countries of the global South being the real victims more of the climate crisis.
And the issue of climate debt.
Yes. Well, it's really quite ironic, just speaking about the energy, for instance, that there's a lot of energy production going on in the South, and we absorb all the dirty and harmful impacts of that energy production, and yet more than 50% of our people do not have enough access to energy for their basic needs. That is one of the injustices of this whole crisis, when we know that it's from excessive consumption of energy, excessive production of goods that are not needed by people, and yet more than half of the people don't have enough to live, to have decent lives. So this is something that we are railing against, and we are saying that this really also illustrates why we are talking about the debt that is owed to our people, not just people of the South, but people everywhere that has been marginalized, has been exploited by this system, is suffering from the effects of this system, like climate change, and is subsidizing the kind of lavish lifestyle that elites and the profits of corporations have been enjoying for a long time. So this debt must be paid. And we are here to say that message loud and clear.
Now, I just want to talk logistics, Clay. On Sunday, the indigenous community will be the first block, although you say that youth will be even in front of you. I wanted you to mention Sunday and then Flood Wall Street, and we only have a minute, which is the direct action. It's being called Family Friendly on Sunday, massive march, and then direct action on Monday in Wall Street.
Well, yes, it's correct. The Indigenous Peoples Bloc will be leading the People's Climate March on Sunday. There is a line of young people from impacted communities, including young Indigenous peoples, that will be marching arm in arm, leading the march. Flood Wall Street is such an important action that I encourage everybody to go down and show their support on. We need to strike at the heart of the economic paradigm. Climate change, tar sands, all of these things, the root problem to it is our economic paradigm. Naomi's book talks about it. We need to engage and to take direct action against the financiers of the global climate crisis.
On Sunday at 7 in the morning, there's a major indigenous ceremony inside Central Park, and there are water ceremonies on Saturday here in New York City.
That's correct. We encourage people to come down to the opening ceremony of the People's Climate March. It starts at 9 a.m., Columbus Circle, and there is a water ceremony on the Hudson River as well.
And the website people go to find out all this information?
IndigenousRising.org is a website. You can get information at idlemore.com. And of course, all the information is compiled on peoplesclimatemarch.org.
We're going to leave it there. Clayton Thomas Muller, Indigenous Tar Sands campaigner, Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, head of the Union Theological Seminary, Liddy Knockbeal Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice in from the Philippines. And of course, Democracy Now! Will be there on Sunday Day. Check our website, democracynow.org. From Sunday, 10:30 to 1:30 Eastern Time, we'll be broadcasting live to the world. A very happy birthday to Amy Littlefield. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Zara Mate, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Selma Kafani, Masood Rabi, Karen Dina Gesder, Amy Littlefield. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.